Ted Davis is Distinguished Professor of the History of Science at Messiah University. He's also an Affiliate Fellow in History of Science at the University of Oklahoma and a Fellow of the Distinguished International Society for Science and Religion. He's co-edited the works of the physicist Robert Boyle in 14 volumes, and he's edited Boyle's treatise on God and the Mechanical Philosophy with the delightful title, A Free Inquiry into the Vulgarly Received Notion of Nature, published by Cambridge University Press. He's published dozens of articles and essays about religion and science, and he's currently writing a book about Christianity and the rise of modern science. Welcome, Ted Davis.
I'm Ted Davis. I'm a historian of science with particular interest in the history of Christianity and science. If you ask a person on the street these days what they think about science and religion, including science and Christianity, you often hear rumors of war. Well, interestingly, it's people in the history of science field that have done most of the hard work of debunking that particular popular view. So if you want a short version of what I do, that's it. I'm in the business of debunking the notion of an ongoing, inevitable conflict between science and Christian faith. The real history doesn't look anything like that. I didn't start out at university knowing I was going to be doing this at some point in my life. I wanted to be an astrophysicist when I went to university. I was pretty sure about that. I also knew that I hated the humanities, which is kind of interesting given what I do these days, and that I would never teach. So like a lot of other people, I learned a lot about myself at university. I hope that happens to you. At a good university, it should. Students will learn things about themselves that they didn't know before. Some of those things might be a little scary, but most of them usually turn out pretty well. A few years after university, I figured out what I wanted really to do, which is what I'm doing now. And it helped in figuring that out to make connections with the American Scientific Affiliation. This is an organization of Christians in the sciences that has a high-level conversation about science and faith in a lot of ways, in print and at annual meetings and through informal relationships one makes through the organization. It's been very helpful to me, and I urge young students to get familiar with the ASA. But once I figured this out, then I decided to get a graduate degree that would facilitate this. And in those days, perhaps the best route was to study the history and philosophy of science. So that's what I did. I went off to Indiana to do that. Ironically, I didn't realize at the time that the big star at Indiana, a great Newton expert named Sam Westphal, was as important as he was. And I also didn't know that he was a Christian believer. He mentioned that just once that I could remember in a class, and I remember jaws dropping on students around the table. By and large, it was a department that was not friendly to faith or to people of faith. But a lot of people came nevertheless to help me and to respect me while I was there. And after I finished, I was able to launch a little bit of a career working on American science and religion in the modern period, and also on the so-called scientific revolution, the period from Copernicus to Newton, and science and religion there, especially Robert Boyle. A lot of people were helpful all the way along. I'm grateful for that.
Drew Rick Miller studied literature and physics at Northwestern University before earning a Master's of Divinity degree from Princeton Theological Seminary. He spent more than 10 years with the John Templeton Foundation, where he led the Religious Engagement Department. There, he developed programs helping religious leaders engage science. He's currently project co-director of Science for the Church. We're honored and delighted to have him with us. Welcome, Drew Rick Miller.
I've had the privilege of spending my entire professional career working at the interface of faith and science. I think it began with high school physics with Mr. King. He was the one who taught me both to love science and to take joy in the way that mathematics described the physical world. He also let it be known to his classes that he was a person who went to church. And that was formative for me because it was late in high school and into college that I began to ask what I believed. I had been brought up in the church and I had questions, especially about science and faith. and needed to know if a person of faith could pursue their love of science. In college, I was nearly done with a physics major, taking a quantum mechanics class, which was one of the last requirements. It was at that point that I realized physics may not be it for me. I think my score on that final exam was something like 20%. Fortunately, I had other interests. I was pursuing a double major in physics and English literature. And so upon graduation, I did what every major in English literature and minor in physics would do. I went to seminary. And that took me to Princeton Seminary. I went there not just for the financial aid package, but also to study with theology and science professor Wenzel van Hoisting. It was Dr. van Hoisting who opened me to the wonders of this interdisciplinary field of theology and science. He gave me the freedom to ask my questions and the resources to begin to pursue answers. But I must confess, at times it felt a lot like that quantum mechanics final exam, in that I don't think I found a whole lot of correct answers. But there was also a really profound lunch that I was able to have while I was at seminary. I was able to join one of my intellectual heroes, John Pokinghorn, someone you may have heard of, who was an accomplished physicist who became a priest and a theologian. He was in town for a lecture, and Dr. van Hoisting arranged a lunch for several of us to pepper him with questions for over an hour. For some of our questions, he had really good answers. And for a good number of others, he offered what you might call educated opinions. He used phrases like, "I think it might be the case," or "it strikes me that God could have." It was that humility that my intellectual hero could admit that he didn't have all the answers that was really profound on me. It gave me the permission to keep asking those questions and to not worry when I didn't have absolutely satisfactory answers. It was an encouragement that I could seek to grow in my faith, in my understanding of God, both through the book of Scripture and the book of nature. Today, my focus is on the church and how it engages science and how it works with scientists. At Science for the Church, we are asking if we can strengthen the church through an engagement with science. It worked for me, and I pray it can for others.
James C. Unguriano is the author of Science, Religion, and the Protestant Tradition, published by the University of Pittsburgh Press. In this book, he challenges the origins, developments, and popularization of the so-called conflict thesis, the idea that science and religion are fundamentally and irrevocably at odds. As an intellectual historian, he explores the broad scope of Christian thought from antiquity to the present. He's currently historian in residence in the George L. Massey program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. We are honored and delighted to have him with us.
Hello, my name is James Unguriano. I'm not a scientist, but rather a historian of science with a keen interest in the history of ideas, particularly Christian ideas. My own spiritual journey has followed alongside my intellectual journey. Before I was an academic, I was actually an architectural drafter. I did that for about 6 years before the Lord came into my life. While I was working as a drafter, I also started taking philosophy courses at a local community college. I began reading Plato and Aristotle and other great ancient Greek philosophers. I soon discovered Paul Davies' book, God and the New Physics. In this book, Davies seamlessly weaves together discussions on physics, mathematics, philosophy, and theology. He introduced me to Western religious thought, including a number of important theologians like St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, Roger Bacon, Francis Bacon, and the like. This became my spiritual awakening. These writers introduced me to the Bible, and the Bible ultimately led me to Christ. So I knew early on in my walk that Christianity was not only this feeling of absolute dependence, and no doubt it is, but also has this rich intellectual history. So at that point, I quit architectural drafting and decided to pursue a life of the mind. Now, the history of science and religion has always interested me. From my own research, I've come to the conclusion that the relationship between science and religion has always been very complicated. To borrow from neo-Orthodox theologian Richard Niebuhr, this is the so-called enduring problem. But for me, I've come to embrace St. Augustine's notion that all truth is God's truth. And that, I think, remains relevant for Christians in science today. We are called to bring all human learning, research, and discovery to bear on these fundamental questions. Now, the Augustinian solution to the alleged conflict is humility, both in the interpretation of nature and the interpretation of Scripture. But more than that, for St. Augustine, Christ is the transformer of culture, in the sense that he redirects and reinvigorates and regenerates the life of humanity, and expressed in all our works. There is room within this approach for the thought that mathematics, logic, the natural sciences, even the fine arts and technology may all become instruments of that new love of God that rejoices in his whole creation and serves all his creatures.
I'm Dr. Owen Anderson, and I'm a professor of philosophy and religious studies at Arizona State University. And I'd like to welcome Gregory Kuzona. He teaches at Chico State, where he teaches courses on science and religion and the great books and ideas, including transcendence and human knowledge. His areas of research include religion and science, the New Testament, Western religions, and literature and philosophy since the Enlightenment. He has books that are on the topic of science and religion, including Mere Science and Christian Faith, Bridging the Divide with Emerging Adults. And the phrase mere science, of course, brought to my mind C.S. Lewis. And he also has a book on C.S. Lewis titled C.S. Lewis and the Crisis of a Christian. So I'm glad and encouraged to welcome Gregory Kutzona.
I grew up with a father who loved to study how things work, who taught me, in a way, the essence of science. My father was trained as an engineer, and from a very early age, he loved to analyze the physics and the practical effect of different structures and design. I remember one thing that stuck out was we used to drink out of these Coke glasses. They started small at the bottom, they got wider at the top. They were really easy to hold, but my dad always said, Greg, that is an unstable glass. The center of gravity is high. It can tip over at any moment. And so I began to study things. I remember in fourth grade, I went with our class to the Santa Cruz Mountains. I grew up in Northern California, went up to the Santa Cruz Mountains for a week, and I began to look at nature more closely. Began to look at the beauty of the redwoods, the beauty of just the environment that was always a little bit moist and green in the Santa Cruz Mountains, but especially I loved the banana slug. The banana slug just enthralled me, and it seems to enthrall people in the area. I don't know if you know of UC Santa Cruz, their mascot is the banana slug. But I remember in that outdoor education coming to love the intricacies of nature. You see, I wasn't yet a Christian. In fact, it was this day, as I record this video, that I became a Christian as a first-year student. In fact, it's kind of a joke. Go to UC Berkeley and become a Christian. But that's what happened to me. Now, one of the things that happened also at Berkeley is I met some very smart, skeptical professors and students who told me that if I really wanted to be a thinking person, I had to challenge and even throw away my faith. And so I struggled as a young Christian, loving the intricacy of nature around me, and also loving the God who made nature and who redeemed me in Jesus Christ, to figure out how all that came together. In graduate school, I studied with Robert John Russell, who's a theologian and physicist, and he showed me the intricate structures of quantum reality, as well as the unusual features of special relativity and general relativity. And I remember in his classes, I saw the way in which the intricacies of nature and the profound discoveries we have in our Christian faith could come together and mutually enhance one another. In fact, he calls it creative mutual interaction. I'll close then with a quote that I treasure that summarizes this. It comes from the head of the National Institutes of Health, Francis Collins. I find that studying the natural world is an opportunity to observe the majesty, the elegance, and the intricacy of God's creation.
My name is Kelly Fitzsimmons Burton, and I'm a professor at Paradise Valley Community College, where I teach philosophy and religious studies. Today, I have the honor of introducing one of our fine conversation partners. Bethany Sola-Reeder is a postdoctoral fellow in science and religion at the University of Oxford, where she specializes in theology concerning evolution and the problem of suffering. Bethany received her PhD in theology from the University of Exeter and an MCS in interdisciplinary studies from Regent College, Vancouver. Her research interests, which I find fascinating, include theodicy, animal theology, history of science and religion, readings of Genesis, and practical theology. I checked out several of her videos on YouTube and would encourage you to do the same.
My journey to integrate faith and science began with a simple and common question. Why would a good God allow so many to suffer? I was witness to a situation of abuse, and it kindled that question in me. Unfortunately, as an academic theological question, this is one of the areas where there's very little that's new to say. So many people have written on that question. But I did realize that very few people have written on animal suffering, especially throughout evolutionary history. Now, this is one of the primary questions Christians face when they start looking at God's creation through evolution. Now, for me, that was never really a problem. I'd always accepted evolution, but it did bother me that evolution meant that God created the world with suffering, with death, not as accidental byproducts, but as actual drivers of the process of evolution. And in some ways, animal suffering is a more difficult question than human suffering, since you cannot simply blame it on the fall or on their own bad moral choices. So I embarked on a master's and then a PhD on this subject. And I often say that I think I did two PhDs, one of the head, but also one of the heart. Thinking and writing about suffering should not be divorced from our own experiences of suffering in the world. And so what is, at one level, an academic exercise became a real exercise of the heart and the soul as well. Is this God who I was reading about and writing about a God that I could trust? Is this a God I could love? And do my academic approaches help me to face my own suffering and the suffering I encounter in the world with courage and with patience? If not, it might be time to try another approach rather than let logic be the only dictator of what a good answer might be. Now, I found that in the end, although I have by no means solved these questions, I have built a deeper, more resilient faith in the God of love through asking difficult questions of the often troubling natural history that science has discovered. So I encourage you, if you're facing what appears to be a conflict between your faith and science, don't back away. Don't avoid that. Instead, take the opportunity to dive in and ask the difficult questions, and you may find that it leads you to a deeper, more resilient faith.